Jeremy Corbyn assumed the position of Leader of the Opposition after being elected as Leader of the Labour Party on 12 September 2015. The election was triggered by Ed Miliband's resignation following the Labour Party's electoral defeat of the 2015 general election when David Cameron formed a majority Conservative government. Corbyn appointed his first shadow cabinet in September 2015. A small reshuffle occurred on 5 January 2016, with one further resignation on the 11th of January 2016. Dozens of further resignations occurred on 26 and the 27th of June 2016. Shadow cabinet members since October 2016. Creation. Corbyn named his first shadow cabinet appointments on 13 September and announced its full composition on 14 September. One of Labour's largest reshuffles. The announcement was further delayed by a large number of previous shadow cabinet members publicly announcing they would not participate under Corbyn, even if called to do so. The following members declined to serve. Chris Leslie was replaced as Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer by John McDonnell. Yvette Cooper was replaced as Shadow Home Secretary by Andy Burnham. Chuka Umunna was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills by Angela Eagle, who was further appointed Shadow First Secretary of State, deputizing at Prime Minister's questions, a role that was filled by Hilary Benn in the previous shadow cabinet. Rachel Reeves was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions by Owen Smith, though she was on maternity leave at the time of her announcement and the brief had been filled by Stephen Timms since shortly after the general election, who himself rejected a junior role. Tristram Hunt was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Education by Lucy Powell. Emma Reynolds was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government by John Trickett, who was also appointed to a new role as Shadow Minister for the Constitutional Convention. Caroline Flint was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change by Lisa Nandy. Mary Cray was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for International Development by Diane Abbott. Shabana Mahmood was replaced as Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury by Seema Malhotra. Liz Kendall resigned as Shadow Minister for Care and Older People. Attending Shadow Cabinet. A junior minister is yet to be announced. The remaining changes are as follows. Harriet Harman, who had previously announced she would step down from frontbench politics after nearly 30 years, was replaced as Deputy Leader by Tom Watson, who also replaced Powell as Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office. Burnham was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Health by Heidi Alexander. Vernon Coker was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Defense by Maria Eagle. Angela Eagle was replaced as Shadow Leader of the House of Commons by Chris Bryant. Michael Duffer was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Transport by Lillian Greenwood. Ivan Lewis, who stated he was willing to serve, was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland by Coker. Owen Smith was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Wales by Nia Griffith. Maria Eagle was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs by Kerry McCarthy. Bryant was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport by Duffer. Trickett was replaced as Shadow Minister without portfolio by John Ashworth. Not as a full member, like Trickett, but still attending Shadow Cabinet. Gloria de Pierro was replaced as Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities by Kate Green, but was appointed to a new role as Shadow Minister for Young People and Voter Registration with full Shadow Cabinet membership. Luciana Berger was appointed to a new role as Shadow Minister for Mental Health with full Shadow Cabinet membership. The Lord Bark was replaced as Shadow Attorney General. Attending Shadow Cabinet by Catherine McKinnell. Roberta Blackman-Woods was replaced as Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning by John Healey, though Healey would be attending Shadow Cabinet. Unlike Blackman-Woods' composition, in his inaugural Shadow Cabinet, 17 out of 31 members were women, making it the first frontbench team in British parliamentary history to comprise a female majority. Corbyn was criticised for giving what are traditionally seen as the top jobs, Chancellor, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary, to men, although he insisted that positions such as Education and Health Secretary were just as important. All members of Corbyn's first shadow cabinet previously voted in favour of the Marriage, Same-Sex Couples Act 2013. January 2016 reshuffle. On 6 January 2016, Corbyn replaced Shadow Culture Secretary Michael Duffer with Shadow Defence Secretary Maria Eagle, who was in turn replaced by Shadow Employment Minister Emily Thornberry. He also replaced Shadow Europe Minister, not attending Shadow Cabinet, Pat McFadden with Pat Glass. The reshuffle prompted 3 junior shadow ministers to resign in solidarity with McFadden: Shadow Rail Minister Jonathan Reynolds, Shadow Defence Minister Kevin Jones and Shadow Foreign Minister Stephen Doughty. On 7 January, Reynolds was replaced by Andy MacDonald, Doughty by Fabian Hamilton, Jones by Kate Hollin and Thornberry by Angela Rayner, as well as appointing Jenny Chapman to the Education team and Joe Stevens to the Justice team. On the 11th of January 2016, Shadow Attorney General Catherine McKinnell resigned, citing party infighting, family reasons and a wish to speak in Parliament away from front-bench responsibilities. She was replaced by Carl Turner. June 2016 reshuffle. Resignations. On Sunday 26 June and Monday 27 June 2016, a number of members of the Shadow Cabinet either resigned or were sacked. This process began with Jeremy Corbyn sacking Hilary Benn as Shadow Foreign Secretary in the early hours of Sunday morning after Benn informed Corbyn that he had lost confidence in his leadership in the wake of the vote to leave the European Union. Subsequently, the following resigned, in chronological order: Heidi Alexander, Shadow Health Secretary; Gloria De Piero, Shadow Minister for Young People and Voter Registration; Ian Murray, Shadow Scottish Secretary; Lillian Greenwood, Shadow Transport Secretary; Lucy Powell, Shadow Education Secretary; Kerry McCarthy, Shadow Environment Secretary; Seema Malhotra, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury; Vernon Coker, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary; Charles Falconer, Shadow Justice Secretary; Carl Turner, Shadow Attorney General; Chris Bryant, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons; Diana Johnson, Shadow Foreign and Commonwealth Minister. On 27 June, Lisa Nandy, Shadow Energy Secretary; Owen Smith, Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary; Angela Eagle, Shadow First Secretary of State and Shadow Business Secretary; John Healey, Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning; Nia Griffith, Shadow Welsh Secretary; Maria Eagle, Shadow Culture Secretary; Kate Green, Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities; Luciana Berger, Shadow Minister for Mental Health. On 29 June, Pat Glass, new Shadow Education Secretary. All cited concerns over the EU vote and Corbyn's leadership. New appointments. Following the resignations, Corbyn appointed several new MPs to shadow cabinet positions. Emily Thornberry, Shadow Foreign Secretary; Diane Abbott, Shadow Health Secretary; Pat Glass, Shadow Education Secretary, resigned on 29 June 2016. Andy MacDonald, Shadow Transport Secretary; Clive Lewis, Shadow Defence Secretary; Rebecca Long-Bailey, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury; Kate Osamor, Shadow International Development Secretary; Rachel Maskell, Shadow Environment Secretary. Kat Smith, Shadow Minister for Voter Engagement and Youth Affairs. Dave Anderson, Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary. Dave Anderson, Shadow Scottish Secretary. Richard Bergen, Shadow Justice Secretary. Debbie Abrahams, Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. Graham Morris, Shadow Communities Secretary. Barry Gardiner, Shadow Energy Secretary. John Trickett, Shadow Lord President of the Council. John Trickett, Shadow Business Secretary. Angela Rayner, Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. Later appointed Shadow Education Secretary. Angela Rayner, Shadow Education Secretary. Paul Flynn, Shadow Secretary of State for Wales. Paul Flynn, Shadow Leader of the House of Commons. Kelvin Hopkins, Shadow Culture Secretary. Emily Thornberry, Shadow Secretary of State for Exiting the European Union. Barry Gardiner, Shadow International Trade Secretary. October 2016 reshuffle. Following his victory in the 2016 Labour Party leadership election, Jeremy Corbyn began a reshuffle of his cabinet on the 7th of October. Leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn. Deputy Leader and Shadow Culture Secretary, Tom Watson. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John McDonnell. Shadow Foreign Secretary, Emily Thornberry. Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott. Shadow Education Secretary, Angela Rayner. Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary, Debbie Abrahams. Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth. Shadow Defense Secretary, Nia Griffith. Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rebecca Long-Bailey. Shadow Secretary of State for Exiting the European Union, Keir Starmer. Shadow Business Secretary, Clive Lewis. Shadow International Trade Secretary, Barry Gardiner. Shadow International Development Secretary, Kate Osamor. Shadow Transport Secretary, Andy MacDonald. Shadow Communities Secretary, Theresa Pearce. Shadow Environment Secretary, Rachel Maskell. Shadow Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor, Richard Bergen. Shadow Lord President of the Council, John Trickett. Shadow Attorney General, the Baroness Chakrabarty. Shadow Scotland Secretary and Northern Ireland Secretary, Dave Anderson. Shadow Wales Secretary, Joe Stevens. Shadow Housing Secretary, John Healey. Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, Sarah Champion. Shadow Black and Minority Ethnic Communities Minister, Dawn Butler. Shadow Voter Engagement and Youth Affairs Minister, Kat Smith. Shadow Cabinet Office Minister, Ian Lavery. Shadow Mental Health and Social Care Minister, Barbara Keeley. Shadow Minister without Portfolio, Andrew Gwynn. Shadow Leader of the House of Commons, Valerie Vass. Summary of changes. Owen Smith, who lost to Corbyn in the preceding leadership election, declined to continue in Shadow Cabinet, if offered. The Baroness Smith of Basildon and the Lord Bassam of Brighton formally returned to Shadow Cabinet as Shadow Leader of the House of Lords and Shadow Chief Whip of the House of Lords after boycotting following the June reshuffle. Tom Watson, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, was moved from Shadow Minister for the Cabinet Office and replaced by Ian Lavery. Andy Burnham resigned as Shadow Home Secretary to focus on his 2017 bid for Mayor of Greater Manchester and was replaced by Diane Abbott. This made the first Labour frontbench where two of the great offices of state were held by women. Clive Lewis was moved from Shadow Secretary of State for Defence and was replaced by Nia Griffith. Louis was given the newly merged Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy to reflect the departmental changes at Whitehall. John Trickett, who had been Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, remained Shadow Lord President of the Council and Director of Campaigns and Elections. Barry Gardiner, who had been Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, remained Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade. Emily Thornberry remained Shadow Foreign Secretary, but was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union by Keir Starmer. Abbott was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Health by John Ashworth. Graham Morris went on leave and was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government and Shadow Minister for the Constitutional Convention by Theresa Pearce. Kelvin Hopkins was replaced as Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport by Watson. John Healey, who had resigned as Shadow Secretary of State for Housing in the previous June reshuffle, returned and was promoted to Shadow Secretary of State for Housing. Paul Flynn retired from Shadow Cabinet and was replaced as Shadow Leader of the House of Commons by Valerie Vass, and as Shadow Secretary of State for Wales by Joe Stevens. The Baroness Chakrabarti was appointed as Shadow Attorney General, which had been vacant since Carl Turner's resignation in June. Rosie Winterton was replaced as Shadow Chief Whip of the House of Commons by Nick Brown. Barbara Keeley was appointed Shadow Minister for Mental Health, which had been vacant since Luciana Berger's resignation in June. Dawn Butler was appointed to a new post as Shadow Minister for Black and Minority Ethnic Communities. Ashworth was replaced as Shadow Minister without portfolio by Andrew Gwynn. February 2017 reshuffle. Resignations. On Thursday, the 19th of January, Jeremy Corbyn was reported to be preparing to order Labour MPs to vote to support triggering Article 50 in the vote on the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Bill 2017, in line with a three-line whip. This triggered the following resignations from the front bench, in chronological order. On Thursday, the 26th of January, Tulip Siddiq, Shadow Minister for Early Years, not in Shadow Cabinet. On Friday, the 27th of January, Joe Stevens, Shadow Welsh Secretary. On Wednesday, the 1st of February, Dawn Butler, Shadow Minister for Diverse Communities. Rachel Maskell, Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. On Wednesday, the 8th of February, Clive Lewis, Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Replacements. Clive Lewis was replaced by Rebecca Long-Bailey as Shadow Business Secretary. Rebecca Long-Bailey was replaced by Peter Dowd as Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Rachel Maskell was replaced by Sue Hayman as Shadow Environment Secretary. Joe Stevens was replaced by Christina Rees, politician, as Shadow Welsh Secretary. Economic Advisory Committee. On the 27th of September 2015, the formation of an Economic Advisory Committee was announced, with John McDonnell saying, "I am delighted to convene this Economic Advisory Committee that will assist in developing a radical but pragmatic and deliverable economic policy for our country." Quote, David Blanchflower, Professor, Dartmouth College and former member of the Monetary Policy Committee, resigned the 29th of June 2016. Mariana Mazzucato, Professor, University of Sussex. Anastasia Nevetalova, Professor, City, University of London. Thomas Piketty, Professor, Paris School of Economics, resigned the 29th of June 2016. Anne Pettifer, Director, Policy Research in Macroeconomics, Prime. Joseph Stiglitz, Professor, Columbia University and recipient of the 2001 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. Simon Wren Lewis, Professor, University of Oxford. Danny Blanchflower quit the panel and said he would also wind up his review of the role of the Bank of England on the 28th of June 2016 following the mass resignations of the Shadow Cabinet, joining them in calling for Corbyn to step down. Piketty revealed that he had also left the panel in June, citing work commitments. whilst other members of the panel issued a statement saying the panel had agreed to delay further meetings but would be honoured to serve the Labour Party in future after the leadership situation was resolved. Simon Wren Lewis later joined with Blanche Flower endorsing Owen Smith over Corbyn for the leadership on 31 July 2016. The current status of the committee after Corbyn's re-election as leader and subsequent reshuffle in October 2016 is unknown. See also: Official opposition, United Kingdom. Official opposition frontbench, Cabinet of the United Kingdom. British government frontbench, Liberal Democrat frontbench team. Frontbench team of Angus Robertson.